A man is bent over a wooden table in Washington, D.C., ink still wet on his fingers, drawing a line across a piece of paper, and that line will determine where millions of people live, work, and die for the next 2 centuries. That map wasn't drawn by geographers studying the land. It wasn't based on rivers, mountain passes, or where people already lived. It was drawn by a small committee of men managing a financial crisis, and the lines they chose that afternoon quietly became the skeleton of modern America. In 1785, the United States government was essentially broke. The Revolutionary War had just ended, the new nation had mountains of debt, and Congress had no reliable way to collect taxes. But it did have one asset: land. Enormous, unclaimed, at least by European legal standards, land stretching west of the original 13 states. So on May 20th, 1785, Congress passed the Land Ordinance of 1785, a single piece of legislation that would reshape the physical face of a continent. The law created something called the Public Land Survey System, starting from a point in East Liverpool, Ohio, a place called the Point of Beginning. Government surveyors were ordered to divide all western land into a perfect grid, 6 miles by 6 miles, every square called a township. Each township subdivided into 36 sections of exactly 1 square mile, every line perfectly perpendicular, every corner mathematically precise. It didn't matter if a river ran through it. It didn't matter if a hill made the geometry absurd. The grid went down anyway. And the moment those lines existed on paper, they started deciding everything. Because a grid that exists on a map becomes a grid that exists in dirt, in roads, in fence lines, in the walls of buildings not yet built. Those grid lines weren't just geometric curiosities, they were product listings. The 1785 ordinance immediately put those surveyed sections up for sale. A single section, 1 square mile, 640 acres, sold for a minimum of $1 per acre. That's $640 in 1785, roughly equivalent to $22,000 today. Speculators, not farmers, bought most of it. The Ohio Company of Associates purchased 1.5 million acres in a single transaction in 1787. The Scioto Company grabbed another 3.5 million. These weren't people who wanted to farm. These were people who understood that whoever controlled the grid controlled the future. They bought sections in bulk, held them, and waited for settlers to arrive, at which point the speculators sold individual lots at enormous markups. The grid had done something invisible but irreversible. It had turned land into a commodity with a standardized unit. You could trade Ohio soil the same way you traded tobacco or flour without ever visiting the place. Land became abstract. And when land becomes abstract, the people who understand abstraction, financiers, lawyers, speculators, gain power over the people who work the actual soil. The farmers who moved west often arrived to find the best land already locked up. They rented it or bought it on credit from men who had never once stood on it. Here's where the grid stops being a financial tool and starts being an urban architect. When settlers established towns, they didn't choose their locations freely. They chose locations dictated by the grid. Roads followed section lines because section lines were the legal boundaries. Towns sprouted at intersections of those roads because intersections were where trade happened. And because every section was the same size and every township was the same size, towns ended up spaced with eerie regularity across the landscape, typically 6 to 12 miles apart. That spacing wasn't accidental. It matched the distance a horse-drawn wagon could travel in half a day. A farmer could drive to town, sell grain, buy supplies, and return home before dark. The grid had absorbed human biology, the limits of animal transport, and baked it into the map. By 1850, this pattern had produced hundreds of identically structured Midwestern towns: courthouse in the center, roads running exactly north-south and east-west, residential blocks of identical dimensions stretching outward. Visit Peoria, Illinois. Visit Des Moines, Iowa. Visit Salina, Kansas. The bones are the same because the law that created them was the same. What looked like organic community growth was actually the physical expression of a congressional vote taken before most of those towns' founders were born. The grid's most consequential moment came not in 1785, but in 1862, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act. That law offered 160 acres, exactly 1/4 of a surveyed section, to any adult who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. Free. The result was the largest planned human migration in American history. Between 1862 and 1934, the federal government transferred 270 million acres, 10% of the entire landmass of the United States, to private citizens directly through this program. 1.6 million individual claims. The grid didn't just accommodate that migration, it directed it. Homesteaders didn't wander and settle where the land felt right. They arrived at a land office, were shown a map of available quarter sections, and chose from what was open on the grid. The railroad companies, which by then had received vast land grants of their own, 170 million acres between 1850 and 1870, built their lines along section boundaries too, because the grid made right-of-way negotiations simpler. And where the railroads went, new towns erupted every 7 to 10 miles, because that was the economical distance between grain elevator stops. The railroad schedule and the 1785 survey were having a conversation across 80 years of history, and the result was a continent wired for settlement in a pattern decided before the settlers existed. Go back to that man with ink on his fingers in 1785. Here is what he was actually doing. He was setting the coordinate system for a civilization that didn't exist yet. Every city that rose along a section line road, every suburb carved out of a surveyed quarter section, every highway that runs perfectly straight across 4 states because it's following a survey boundary drawn in the 18th century. All of it traces back to a grid imposed on a continent by a committee trying to pay off a war debt. There are 2.5 billion acres in the contiguous United States. Roughly 1.8 billion of them, nearly 3/4, were surveyed and divided under the 1785 system. The grid shaped where water pipes went, because pipes follow roads. It shaped where schools were built, because Section 16 of every township was legally reserved for public education. The first federal education funding in American history, embedded silently inside a land survey. It shaped racial geography. Red-line neighborhoods in the 20th century followed block boundaries that followed section lines that followed a survey from before the Civil War. The people who drew those lines in 1785 weren't urban planners. They weren't sociologists. They were solving a budget problem. And yet their solution became the hidden architecture of American life, so deep in the structure of every city and town that most people living inside it have never once noticed it's there. The hook you heard at the start, one man, one map, one afternoon, wasn't an exaggeration. It was the most understated version of the truth. Follow one fact a day, no fluff. And here's what nobody talks about. If the grid shaped American cities, why do some of America's most powerful cities, Boston, New York's oldest neighborhoods, San Francisco's waterfront, completely ignore it?